July 19th, 2009, Isle La Motte, Vermont. Across from St. Anne's Shrine, there very shortly will be rededication of the Samuel D. Champlain monument that has been here since shortly after the Montreal World's Fair. Governor James Douglas is supposed to be in attendance, along with the guest speaker, Dr. Sylvie Boudreau from Plattsburgh State. The sandy beach right here is where legend has it, and historians say Samuel D. Champlain first set foot in what is now the United States of America, and they came through here in 1609. This is the sandy beach that we were talking about. Interpretive panels are getting more and more popular, and no exception, there is an interpretive panel here overlooking the lake, and it explains to visitors in two languages, French and English, the importance of this particular location.
Thank you all for being here. It's been a busy day for us at St. Anne's Shrine, a quadri-centennial celebration of Millington area in the state of Vermont. And I'm very pleased that the Society of St. Edmund could host this particular celebration with St. Michael's College, celebrating the lake and our history and our heritage. And as we celebrated at Mass today, we call to mind the role of Catholicism in the founding of the state of Vermont in the colonial times, back to the 17th century, 1666, where we celebrated the first Mass, probably north, they say north of Florida. I guess that would be Augustine. So I want a sincere welcome on behalf of Father Michael Croning, our Superior General. I'd like to introduce Dr. Eric Mahoney. Jack Newhouser, President of St. Michael's College, will share with us a few words.
I too would simply like to welcome you and thank Father Brian and Father Mike for allowing us to share this day with you. One of the great functions of a college is memory, is to encourage people to recognize a heritage. So this is a very appropriate function for us. We, after all, are part of the heritage that Samuel de Champlain first began in this area. As you know, he too came here with the intention of bringing a culture to this area, although unlike most of the European explorers, he was quite accepting of the culture that was already here and saw that there would likely be a great merger over a period of time. So it's very good for us to have a small role in helping celebrate, this great time and this great event. And it's really a rare treat in historical annals to be actually able to come to the very place where we first touched what is now the United States. So we welcome everyone here. We thank everybody for being here, especially the press of New York, and look forward to a great celebration and a great rededication. We should remember things. It's very important that we do so. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Newhouser. My name is Edward Mahoney. I teach at St. Michael's College in the Religious Studies Department and direct the Graduate Theology program, and have worked with Marilyn Cormier and a few others on some events for the quadri-centennial. It's a pleasure for me to welcome Professor Sylvie Boudreau, who is from the State University of New York in Plattsburgh. She received her bachelor's from Concordia University in Montreal, and her master's and her PhD from York University in Ontario, with specializations in British history and literature and Canadian history as well. She specializes in Canadian intellectual and cultural history in her writing and her teaching, as well as French-Canadian migration to the United States, Franco-American intellectual and cultural history, and the family. In her own words, she says, "Being at Plattsburgh has been a rewarding experience for me, both as a scholar and a teacher. Since arriving here, I have been able to explore the local community's heritage as a borderland area. The whole North Country is rich in history, and not surprisingly, French Canadians made up a large immigrant group here. Plattsburgh provides a unique vantage point for the understanding of both American and Canadian history. Currently, I am using this borderland location to enrich the understanding of North American history. It can be compared to the southwestern borderlands of the United States, which present an equally fascinating picture of migration and hybridization of cultures." It is a unique pleasure for me to introduce Professor Sylvie Boudreau.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Way out in the back? Great. Well, it's a beautiful afternoon in July, and it's a real pleasure for me to be here. I'd like to thank Dr. Newhouser of St. Michael's College and Dr. Edmund Mahoney for inviting me to give this talk. And I think it's very exciting to be here because around about 100 years ago, Americans came to this very location to commemorate and to celebrate the history of this area. And today, 100 years after the 1909 tercentenary, we're gathered in the very same place in a way to do the same thing they did in 1909, which is to remember and to recall and to understand the meaning of this place in history. So what I'm going to do for you today, I hope, is talk to you about the origins, obviously talk to you about the man of the hour, who's Samuel de Champlain, talk to you about the origins of French settlement in this area, and also talk about how this shrine came into being. So there's going to be a whole lot of stuff happening at the same time, so it should be really interesting and packed full of information. And then I'm going to show you a series of rather beautiful pictures of what happened here at Isle La Motte at the shrine in 1909. And you really get a really chilling sense of how we're almost repeating the cycles of history. But before I start, I just want to note where we are physically, that we are really close to Canada. If you think about the history of this area, there was a really long period where this part of North America, originally inhabited by First Nations, was really part of the French Empire. And so the history of St. Anne's Shrine really is steeped in the history of the presence of French missionaries, French colonizers, military figures. So there's a really fascinating story here, which isn't often very told. So today I'm going to try to weave all that together and talk to you about the tercentenary, talk about what they were remembering in 1909, and sort of weave it all together. So a big part of my presentation will be really dealing with what I like to call the ethnic roots of American Catholicism, or the French roots of American Catholicism, especially in this region. If we were in New Mexico or Arizona, we'd be talking about the Spanish origins or the Hispanic origins of Catholicism in the Southwest. But here in the Northeast, the origins of Catholicism really lie with the French Catholics who were here round about the same time that the Spaniards were in the Southwest. So let me take you back into the past, and let's talk about what happened here at St. Anne's Shrine in 1909. For the Franco-Americans of northern New York and Vermont, Sunday, July 4th, the opening day of the Champlain Tercentenary Week, was a 4th of July unlike no other. Falling on the Sabbath, it gave them the opportunity to host a pontifical mass at Isle La Motte, a beautiful island situated at the northern extremity of Lake Champlain. Catholic dignitaries from the region and from Canada arrived by various conveyances, streaming from the docks onto the site where it was believed Samuel de Champlain had stopped around the same date in 1609. Priests from the dioceses of Albany, Ogdensburg, Burlington, Montreal, and Quebec, wearing their finest vestments, crowded the open-air altar erected for this purpose. Visiting dignitaries from the International Union Saint-Jean-Baptiste arrived to open Champlain Week in splendid reverence. The weather, like today, cooperated, and the sun shone down on the wooded area surrounding the shrine of St. Anne, which had been established specifically to serve the needs of the French Catholics of the Champlain Valley. Hundreds came to mark the day and to worship together in this magnificent setting. For the French Americans, both visiting and local, the Tercentenary Week would both open and close at St. Anne's Shrine in an air of holiness. It is possible to trace a parallel series of Catholic events throughout the week that began and ended with a solemn Mass at Isle La Motte. In doing so, a picture emerges of the spiritual and intellectual life of the Franco-Americans, something that the official reports and newspaper coverage of the time neglect. What did Champlain mean to these French and Catholic immigrants, or children of immigrants, living in the United States? How did they see the Tercentenary Week celebrations being held by the states of New York and Vermont? And how did the Champlain Tercentenary change their image of themselves? In the summer of 1909, as New York and Vermont prepared the most important series of commemorative events ever to take place in the Champlain Valley, Franco-American Catholics took notice. Not only was Samuel de Champlain being remembered as a discoverer of Lake Champlain, this celebration was being held to honor a man many saw as a Catholic hero. This raises an important question of identity politics, as French-Canadian clerical nationalists had long since burnished Champlain's image as a great explorer, soldier, cartographer, and colonizer, but also as a Christian evangelist. As recent scholarship has shown, this is an image which received widespread support in both Canada and the United States in the early 20th century. Several factors explain why this image of Champlain as a devout and zealous Catholic evangelist was popularized in these years. The Tercentenary events contributed to a transformation of Franco-American Catholics' image of Champlain and of themselves, as well as their place in American society. Through the use of memory and memorializing, a tradition of American Catholicism, which stressed its French roots in the Champlain Valley, was invented. In the years since his great voyages of exploration, Samuel Champlain had been given a historical makeover. A common man of obscure origins, he had already been ennobled by history, so to speak. And there is also the question of his physical appearance, which has never been resolved. To this day, there is the lingering mystery of locating his final resting place. But by the early 20th century, the question of Champlain's religious identity was clear. This is in part because Champlain had been mythologized by the Catholic clergy of French Canada. Champlain's story of physical stamina, persistence against formidable odds, bravery in warfare, and determination to found a North American colony was used by the Catholic Church as a wonderful pedagogical tool. In French Canada's Catholic school books, composition topics always included Champlain in the great pantheon of Catholic founders of the nation, alongside names like Cartier, Talon, Frontenac, Dollard. Unlike other European conquerors, the great Champlain had not exterminated or brutalized the native people he encountered in the name of the Catholic faith. He formed military and economic alliances with them, and in the eyes of the church was instrumental in bringing them to the Catholic religion. To turn Champlain, a Renaissance man of action, exploration, and empire building, into a Catholic hero was not an easy thing to do, but this romantic image of him persisted in Quebec for most of the 19th and 20th century. The image of Champlain as a Catholic hero was perhaps reinforced for American audiences by the greatest of 19th century storytellers, Francis Parkman. In his Pioneers of New France, Parkman painted a picture of a titanic struggle for empire between heavily racialized groups. The dominant European group, the Protestant Anglo-Americans, fought and won against the subordinate European group, the Catholic French Canadians. In the Parkmanesque worldview, these two groups had strong racial identities. The English were portrayed as hardworking but calculating, abstemious and independent, and also possessing a truer faith. The French, according to Parkman, were usually portrayed as hardworking but fun-loving and free-spending, also as a subordinate and also as being subordinate and having a rather simple Catholic faith. Basically, they were seen as being dominated by the clergy and ultimately by Rome. So this is the Parkmanesque view. In this, Francis Parkman was not unique, as he shared the predominant stereotype views of his time. In his description of the struggle between these two groups to settle the future continent, the element of biological or racial determinism came into play. It's clear from his point of view which group was meant to be victorious or dominant. Parkman merely expressed in historical writings the predominant anti-Catholicism that existed in America at this time. And this Parkmanesque image of Champlain is the one that the American celebrants of the 1909 tercentenary would have shared. At the turn of the century, both French Canadians and Americans shared this racialized perspective. It is a truism of United States history that anti-Catholicism had always been part of America's self-image. It's only in the 20th century that this began to change, and the Champlain tercentenary shows the ways in which this was slowly happening. So there is a strong ethnic quality then to the Catholicism of the Champlain Valley. French-Canadian immigrant populations could, through the celebration of the discovery of the lake by Samuel de Champlain, make the claim that in 1909, they were not just transatlantic immigrants, perhaps like the Irish who had settled in America relatively recently. Instead, they could claim that America was explored and founded by one of theirs, and that the French had been present in the Northeast since the early 17th century. For them, a distinctly Franco-American view of history emerged, which highlighted Champlain's discovery of the lake, the battle against the Iroquois, the founding of Forts St. Anne and St. Frederick, the martyrdom of Jesuit missionaries, and the struggles of the French and Indian War, the bravery of General Montcalm, and the early colonization of the valley by French-Canadian settlers. All of these themes suggested a rich tapestry of memories that could be laid in front of the Franco-American. In 1909, their presence in the Champlain Valley was demographically at its height. They formed the largest ethnic group in many of the towns and villages of the Northeast. A new generation born in the United States had emerged, and a middle class of doctors, lawyers, and professional men and shopkeepers had come into existence. Franco-Americans were also taking an increasingly prominent role in local and state politics. The Naturalization Campaign, naturalization means becoming an American citizen. The Naturalization Campaign was increasingly prominent in local and state politics. Franco-Americans were no longer immigrants, they were being integrated into American cultural identity. For them, the tercentenary was about demonstrating that they were founders of the nation, deserving of respect and possessors of an honorable tradition. The French Canadians thus saw the tercentenary as an opportunity to display their traditions in a public fashion, and that tradition was heavily steeped in Catholicism. French Canadians in the Northeast had for decades been the subject of much hostility, and they were struggling to be seen in a more favorable light. The tercentenary allowed them to convincingly argue that they were not immigrants. In the words of Massachusetts Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, speaking before the Boston City Club in 1908, French Canadians, quote, are hardly to be classed as immigrants in the accepted sense. They represent one of the oldest settlements on this continent. They have been, in the broad sense, Americans for generations. And their coming to the United States is merely a movement of Americans across an imaginary line, from one part of America to the other. So what I'm trying to argue is that the 1909 celebration took place at a time when the French Americans of this area were demographically and economically at their height. They were still culturally very vibrant, and they had not been fully assimilated into the American mainstream. So this is a big part of what was happening here at Isle La Motte in 1909. So what happened in 1909 was local Franco-Americans who lived in the entire Lake Champlain Valley, as well as on the Lake Champlain Islands, came to Isle La Motte, as well as visiting Franco-Americans from the entire northeastern United States. Let me just give you a sense of how strong the community was in 1909. Demographically and institutionally, in 1909, Franco-America would have been at its zenith. In 1909, the Catholic Encyclopedia claimed that the Diocese of Burlington had a Catholic population of 76,000 souls, of which 50,000 were of French-Canadian birth or origin. So of the 76,000 Catholics, 50,000 were of French-Canadian, either directly or of origin. So it comes as no surprise that instead of a national convention, the Union Saint-Jean-Baptiste was a fraternal organization of French-Canadians throughout the northeast of the United States. So instead of having their conference at some town in the northeast, the leaders of the local chapters instead decided to converge on the Champlain Valley for the tercentenary celebrations. And I'm going to show you some pictures of them and posing here at Isle La Motte. So that's what you're going to see in the coming presentation. In the surging crowds that attended the events planned for the community throughout the valley were delegates from Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine, as well, of course, from Vermont and New York. The fact that the states of New York and Vermont, as well as the federal government, should have organized such a series of sublime events in the honor of the great Frenchman who had first explored these lands was not to be missed. Thus, the Champlain tercentenary mixed visiting members of the Union Saint-Jean-Baptiste with French Catholic dignitaries from the United States and Canada and ordinary Franco-Americans. These groups joined together for a collective remembering of the French presence in the Champlain Valley, in the great explorers, warriors, and missionaries who traveled through it, and of the people who had tenaciously settled there since. If the Anglo-Americans were using this occasion to remember 300 years of European and Christian occupation of the valley, the Franco-Americans were using it to honor 300 years of French and Catholic presence in the valley. Slight difference in emphasis. These two interpretations are not incompatible. Their differences are subtle ones of emphasis. But it is possible to see the Champlain tercentenary as marking the strength of the Franco-American identity in the United States. All right, so now I'm going to talk to you about the celebrations here at the St. Anne Shrine. For both the visiting and local Franco-Americans, the official week-long celebration opened and closed with a pontifical mass at St. Anne Shrine right here on these steps that were wooden at the time because the shrine had just been built. You'll see in the pictures, they weren't made of concrete, they were just made of wood. Everything looks very fresh. There's even a pile of lumber in the background, so you get a sense that it's really new. So the week began with a mass here, and it ended with a mass here on July 9th. The site was chosen to be among the 5 official Champlain tercentenary sites because of its connection to Champlain's 1609 visit and the subsequent history of the French in the valley. The island had already been a meeting place well before the building of the shrine. In Joseph Carledu's History of the Confraternity of St. Anne, he notes that from the relation of the Jesuits in 1646, we learn that it was a place of meeting for the Algonquin and Iroquois Indians, and that they camped here often. The Iroquois, returning from their expeditions up the St. Lawrence River, came from the Richelieu or the Iroquois River, and they had to cross a bay 6 miles in extent. This is Carledu's words. The lake at the first island, Isle La Motte, according to Carledu, the lake leans from west to east. Do you believe that? That the lake actually is tilted? So apparently when you're coming down from Canada, you can't help but tilt toward Isle La Motte. That's how it works. I gotta try it. I gotta try doing that. So the lake leans from west to east so that the point lay directly on their route. In a small bay of this point, they found a safe harbor right here for all their canoes. The sandy beach rose up gradually from the water, and it was therefore easy to draw them to the land, to shelter them from the sun and to hide them from their enemies. There was no place in the whole lake better suited for a camping ground, and hence the French selected it for the building of Fort St. Anne. There is reason to believe, based on his account of his trip, that Champlain, his first stop in the lake that would eventually bear his name, was at the northern tip of Isle La Motte, which, as you know, is 7 miles long by 2 miles across. From here, Champlain and his native allies paddled southward to engage in a battle with Mohawk Indians somewhere near present Fort Ticonderoga, New York. Having confirmed their enmity toward the Iroquois nations, the French would subsequently experience many difficulties in establishing a permanent colony in the St. Lawrence, Richelieu, Champlain valleys. In 1665, when New France came under royal administration and the direct control of King Louis XIV, or more appropriately his minister Colbert, a concerted attempt was made to put the colony on a more secure footing. Viceroy Tracy and Governor Courcelle were sent to New France and immediately began to fortify the Richelieu-Champlain Valley. Forts were constructed at Sorel, at the mouth of the Richelieu River, at Chambly, and on Isle La Motte. At the same time, French troops were sent to put down the Iroquois menace. It was Pierre de Saint-Paul, Sieur de La Motte-Lucière, a captain of the Carignan-Salière regiment, who organized its construction in the summer of 1666. So the first French building on this island would have been a fort built to protect and defend the French Empire against the Iroquois here on this island. The man who built it, let me repeat his name, Pierre. The more names you had in the French Ancien Regime, the more elevated you were in social status. So let's just repeat the names. Pierre de Saint-Paul, Sieur de La Motte-Lucière, an idea that he was an individual captain of the Carignan-Salière regiment. So his name was Sieur de La Motte. That's how the island got the name Isle La Motte. La Motte dedicated the fort to St. Anne, the mother of the Blessed Virgin, on July 26, 1666, in the company of 600 of his men who had worked on its construction. With the completion of this so-called fourth fort, built on this sandy point at the north end of Isle La Motte, the French had made an incursion into Iroquois territory. It was the echo of Champlain's earlier incursion and also a consequence of it. Champlain, by coming and fighting the Iroquois in 1609, had alienated the Iroquois from the French, and now the French were obliged to build a fort to defend against the Iroquois. So those things are related, they're not separate. So I have a very able assistant here, my nephew Sam, Samuel. There's a young one here. He's going to be switching the slides. So let's see the first slide, Sam. All right. The religious connection to this to the island for the Franco-Americans can be traced back to the presence of Jesuit missionary Isaac Job on the island. Father Job, along with René Goupil, Guillaume Couture, and 20 Algonquins, was captured by the Iroquois in August of 1642. As they made their way back down the lake toward Iroquois, the war party stopped at their habitual resting place at the north end of the island, here on Isle La Motte. And it's believed that it's here that Father Job submitted to more torture. Father Kerlidu writes, quote, "In the life of Father Job, we find that this journey was for them an occasion of new tortures. His fingernails had already been torn out, and at each halt, new tortures were renewed, and his blood continued to flow. It's probable that he suffered in the halt of the Indians in the first island, where they undoubtedly passed the night. We think that the soil of Isle La Motte was sanctified by the blood of the saintly Jesuit." Father Job's companion, René Goupil, was killed by the blow of a tomahawk on the 24th of September in 1642. Job himself lived for another 4 years, serving as the slave for an Indian family. After his deliverance or his liberation and a voyage to France, he returned to the Champlain Valley 3 more times, traveling as an ambassador of peace to the Iroquois. So the people who had cut out his fingernails and tortured him, he was now trying to make peace with and bring back into concord. At the end of September, he shared the same fate that befell his former companion. Kerlidu writes that on the 18th of October, he was killed like René Goupil, praying for his murderers. Kerlidu believes that while Job is remembered as one of the great Jesuit martyrs, it's unlikely that he can claim to have said the first Mass in Vermont. His captivity would have made this impossible. Instead, Kerlidu believes that the first Catholic Mass was celebrated during the summer of 1666 by Father Dubois, the chaplain of the Carignan-Salière Regiment. This group of French soldiers could be considered the first Catholic congregation of Vermont. The fort was furnished with a small portable altar, and Kerlidu tells us that the places fitted for the altar were often made of bark and evergreen bushes. Eventually, Father Dollier de Casson, who spent 3 months of winter at the fort, arranged for the construction of a small chapel. This chapel was considered by Kerlidu as one of the first in New England, the very first in Vermont, and the first Church of St. Anne in the United States. Given the fact that in the late 19th and 20th centuries, French-Canadian immigrant communities would establish innumerable churches in honor of St. Anne throughout the northeastern United States, this is not an insignificant fact. St. Anne's Shrine at Isle La Motte also had enhanced status due to the fact that it was allied to the most important French-Canadian pilgrimage site to the northeast, that of Sainte-Anne-de-Beaupré in Quebec, outside of Quebec City. By the late 19th century, Sainte-Anne-de-Beaupré was considered the most important Catholic shrine in North America. So St. Anne's Shrine of Vermont was like almost like a branch plant of the larger shrine up in Quebec, and Catholics of the Champlain Valley would make pilgrimages to St. Anne in Quebec in Beaupré, but also they would cross the lake from Champlain to make pilgrimage to this St. Anne's Shrine. So another important chapter in the history of Isle La Motte has to do with Captain de Chazy. Can I have the next slide, Sam? This is Alexandre de Prouville, the Marquis of Tracy, the Viceroy of New France. He has a rather cunning-looking face. He's the man who was sent by the French to put down the Iroquois menace. And while he was here at Isle La Motte, at Fort St. Anne, his nephew, Sieur de Chazy, had heard that there was good hunting to be had across the lake at the mouth of a small river. And he was hunting with some of his French companions. He was a military man, three young men hunting by the river. And they were killed by silent the nephew of the governor of New France was killed by an Iroquois arrow ambush at a river. And the river where he was killed now bears his name. It's called the Chazy River. So the fact that Captain de Chazy was killed by an Iroquois arrow across from Isle La Motte caused the French to make a major raid against the Iroquois to avenge his death, or not to avenge his death, but to prevent future such murders. So history was written at Isle La Motte. It was the occasion of mounting this murder of the nephew of Captain de Tracy, caused the French to mount a major invasion of Iroquois. So that's another interesting history of Fort La Motte. Another interesting fact has to do with the fact that in 1668, having heard much about what had happened there, Monseigneur de Laval, the first bishop of Quebec, in fact the first bishop of North America, decided to visit the island. Here is a picture of Monseigneur de Laval. He was still only vicar apostolic with the title of Bishop of Petre. When he did become Bishop of Quebec, his jurisdiction, his bishopric, was really not very small. His bishopric was, are you ready for this? All of North America. But he knew how to paddle a canoe, so he was okay. So Father Monseigneur de Laval, according to the historian of the shrine, Pierre Ledoux says that Laval can be truly called the first bishop of North America. He noted with pride that today in the country comprised under his jurisdiction, there are about 100 archbishops and bishops with thousands of priests and many millions of Catholics. For American Catholics then, Isle La Motte had a special significance since it's the only place outside of Canada visited by Bishop Laval. Like Champlain before him, Bishop Laval paddled his birch bark canoe and walked through trackless wilderness to make his pastoral visits. Pierre Ledoux conjured up an image of Bishop Laval as a humble and saintly man whose life was so full of good deeds for the glory of God and the salvation of souls. De Laval, it seemed, was a worthy inheritor of the mantle of a great explorer who was known to have said that the salvation of one soul is worth more than the conquest of an entire empire. So there's an interesting connection as well here at Fort St. Anne because it was long considered to be an Abenaki meeting place. Driven from Maine by the English, in 1680 the governor of Canada gave them the country between the Chaudière and Richelieu Lake Champlain corridor. Pierre Ledoux tells us that the Abenaki developed a great devotion to St. Anne, having taken her as the patroness of their tribe. Though their main settlement would be at Saint Francois, Father Pierre Ledoux said that they were great travelers, and from 1687 to 1760 we find them often on Lake Champlain, on the Missisquoi River, on the Winooski, and on the Otter Creek. In the Jesuit Relations, Father Drouillet notes that the Abenaki had a particular devotion to the night on which the Son of God was born, otherwise known as Christmas. Pierre Ledoux quotes him, "On Christmas night they built a small chapel with branches of cedar and spruce to remind them of the stable of Bethlehem. They asked the priest to perform in it all the ceremonies that they have in the churches on that day." Pierre Ledoux notes that in the chapel of St. Anne on Isle La Motte, it was a familiar spot to the Abenaki. He says that parties of Abenaki Indians travel from place to place, camping on the islands and on the shores of the rivers, accompanied by their priests. We may thus conjecture that the holy sacrifice was offered in a great many places of Vermont from 1730 to 1759. Fort St. Anne was directly on their way and dear to them as an old place of meeting. They must have stopped there often and prayed on the site of the old chapel, putting themselves under the protection of the good St. Anne. So anyhow, there's a lot of French history connected with this place. I could talk about it all afternoon, but there's a barbecue waiting for all of you, so I have to make my comments brief because I want to show you the really nice pictures. So Pierre Ledoux, the historian of the shrine, tells us about the efforts on behalf of Burlington's first bishop, who was a Frenchman from France. His name was Louis de Gaubriand, and it was Louis, sorry, I just kicked the stand. It was Louis de Gaubriand who made the effort to foster the devotional cult of St. Anne on Isle La Motte. In fact, when dealing with the de Gaubriand years, Père Ledoux announces that St. Anne sends as its first bishop of Burlington the Right Reverend Louis de Gaubriand from 1853 to 1895. So this is when the shrine actually began to come together in the period of Monseigneur de Gaubriand. So Isle La Motte's Catholic credentials were attributed to the shedding of the blood of a Jesuit martyr and having been the place where the first Catholic Mass in Vermont was celebrated. But the fact that La Motte had named the fort in honor of St. Anne served to solidify the status of this place as a sacred site. St. Anne had long been considered the true patron saint of French Canadian people. Most people think that the patron saint of French Canadians is Saint Jean-Baptiste, but Saint Jean-Baptiste is the political patron saint. The social and cultural patron saint was St. Anne. So that's why she's important to understanding the significance of this shrine. Her feast day in the Catholic calendar was July 26th. That's why they held the celebration here on July 26th. In 1893, Bishop de Gaubriand had established a confraternity of St. Anne and named the Reverend Joseph Père Ledoux the director. In the same year, he erected a statue of St. Anne and a chapel at the site. Sam? So here's an illustration giving you an image of the first statue, the first shrine built here on the island. And you see there's a statue on a wooden pillar with a cover over it. And I don't know if you can see it from the back, but there is a Stations of the Cross in the background. And some Victorian ladies off to the side kneeling in front of the statue. So this was the beginning of the site, and it was de Gaubriand who was responsible for it. It was also de Gaubriand who was responsible for bringing some of St. Anne's relics from Quebec or from Beaupré to the chapel at Isle La Motte. Father Père Ledoux was responsible for much of the success of the site, building a new dock, a rectory, and a large pavilion in front of the chapel. We're sitting in it now. So this pavilion that we're sitting in was built thanks to Father Père Ledoux. In 1895, this confraternity was affiliated to the Arch Confraternity of St. Anne de Beaupré, a major Catholic pilgrimage site. So the period from 1896 to 1916 saw a period of intense activities. Sam, can we have the next slide? As there were over 178 organized Catholic pilgrimages to the shrine from both sides of the Canada-US border. Bishop de Gaubriand had blessed the well at the shrine so that the pilgrims could refresh themselves with the water. And after the death of Father Père Ledoux, the shrine was entrusted in 1904 to the Oblates of the Sacred Heart, known as the Edmundite Fathers. So here's a picture of the interior of this shrine with the statue of St. Anne in 1967. And can we see the next picture? Here's an image of it's not here at the island, but there were pilgrimage sites, Franco-American ones, in every state of the Northeast. And this is just a picture of a procession with a statue of St. Anne in it's around about the 1950s, but it's a French-Canadian pilgrimage in Fiskdale, Massachusetts, where there was also a shrine to St. Anne, just to give you a sense that it's a very strong tradition. So the 1909 Champlain Tercentenary marked another period of growth and expansion for the pilgrimage site. The Edmundite Fathers constructed a new, larger chapel, the one we see behind us, a store for the sale of religious articles, and a larger pavilion in front of the chapel, capable of holding 800 pilgrims, a large dining room attached to the rectory. So actually, one of the legacies of 1909 was the expansion of the pavilion, the one we're sitting in right now. To mark the occasion of the tercentenary, Bishop Jean-Stephen Michaud obtained from Pope Pius X another relic of St. Anne for the shrine. The ceremonies held at Isle La Motte on Friday, July 9th, the last day of the Tercentenary Week. On the last day, they were smaller in scope, but equally of interest. So what I'm going to do now is I want to spend some time showing you the images of what happened from Friday the 4th of July till Friday the 9th, when the ceremonies opened and closed here at Isle La Motte. Many of the dignitaries, like President Taft, didn't come to Isle La Motte. It was a smaller, more modest celebration, but perhaps a more interesting and a more sacred one. In Henry Hill's account of the proceedings, he was one of the Tercentenary commissioners. He said, although somewhat remote from the centers of population, the program did not have the elaborate features of those at Plattsburgh and Burlington, yet it was generally felt that in many essential aspects, the celebration reached its most significant expression and true climax here. Though it was based on a lake-wide celebration, the things that happened here were specific to the Shrine of St. Anne. So let's have a look at what happened here in 1909. Sam, now we're going to really get the pictures. Throughout the valley, there were open-air masses, and this is a really beautiful picture of an open-air mass that was held on July 4th, which was considered Champlain Sunday. It was the 4th of July, but you weren't supposed to have any kind of non-religious, you couldn't have 4th of July celebrations on a Sunday. So instead it became a religious 4th of July with open-air masses. This is the one that took place across the lake at Cliff Haven. And I just wanted to show it to you because you see the altar in the background and you see all the people kneeling down, and it's quite a beautiful image, I find. It gives you a sense of the spirit of the time. Next image. It's a picture of the Franco-American delegates who came from all over the United States for the entire Champlain Tercentenary Week. And if you look carefully, there's some priests in the picture right in the foreground, second from the left. So they were being hosted by the Champlain Valley. And we'll see the same, throughout the presentation, you'll see the same group of figures in various locations. Let's keep going. So the dignitaries from the state of New York, the governor of Vermont, and the Prudy, and the governor of New York, various dignitaries from the United States, they were all traveling by steamboat across Lake Champlain. They were traveling on the steamship, the Ticonderoga, that's now at the Shelburne Museum. And it looks like it was a windless day because there's no wind in the American flag. So they were all arriving for the celebration on Isle La Motte. And we'll see some pictures of the steamboat arriving at the new dock that had been built. So let's look at the next picture. Can you go back, Sam? Can you all see in the background there's a replica of Champlain's ship called the Don de Dieu? It was built for the 1908 Quebec Tercentenary, so they decided to float it down to Lake Champlain, even though Champlain would have never came down here on such a boat. So you see it in the background there, but I want to have you see it in close-up in the next slide. There it is, a replica of Champlain's caravel. Next. Here are some of the Tercentenary guests seated on the upper deck of the Ticonderoga headed toward Isle La Motte. A close-up of the guests. So the man in the background with the tall, sort of glossy hat is Vermont Governor Prudy. Can you all see he's wearing a medallion? He has like a medal on him. He's wearing a Tercentenary medal, which showed that he was part of the celebrations. And just for you to see what's on the medal, let's look at the next slide. So they produced these souvenir medallions which people could buy to raise money for the building of monuments to Champlain. And it shows the arrival of Champlain in the lake on a canoe on one side and a steamboat on the other, 1609, 1909. But I just want to point out to you, under the image of Champlain, both of you in the back can't really see it, but there's two swastikas under it. And when you see it today, it kind of shocks you, but what you have to understand is before the time of Nazi Germany, the swastika is a very old symbol. It's a pagan symbol that sort of means good luck, or good things should happen. So it was appropriated by Hitler and the Nazis. So now we think of it very negatively. So don't get it wrong, right? Don't be confused. Let's look at the next slide. Here are the passengers arriving at Isle La Motte, and I like the picture. There's a sense of anticipation. Note that all the men are wearing straw Panama hats because the Panama Canal is being built, and everyone got that idea that it was cool to wear a Panama hat in summer. Yeah. Let's keep going. The steamer arriving at Isle La Motte, it was a really big deal. They're coming toward, so the guests are going to be streaming off onto the island. Let's keep going. This is New York Governor Hughes, who was a Catholic, arriving at Isle La Motte. Not the two men in the front, but the one behind him. The great international show is about to begin. Governor Hughes and his wife arrive at the specially constructed dock at Isle La Motte. I'm hoping you guys can see this in the back. The Franco-American delegates traveled on their own boat called the Magnet. I just thought that was an interesting way of being in a, I don't know, setting themselves apart. But you know that they're all Americans, but they're waving the stars and stripes. Just because they're French-Canadian doesn't mean they're not 100% American. Here's the Reverend Prevel, Superior General of the Fathers of St. Edmund. They were now in charge of the St. Anne's Shrine. And here he is standing on a podium speaking to the assembled guests. So I feel really honored because here I am speaking to all of you 100 years later. How cool is that, right? How nice. And can you all see, this is Calvin Castine here with a camera taking a picture, taking a video of me. And I just want to point out, can you see in the bottom right here, there's a camera? History repeats itself. The governors of New York and Vermont and the dignitaries are in the front row. Let's have a look at the next slide. This is a close-up. Can you all see how the steps to the shrine are made of wood? And he's standing, it's sand, and he's standing on a wooden platform. And I just want to point out the dignitaries in the front, but can you see there's a young lady in a white dress with white stockings sitting in the foreground? That's Miss Dorothea Smith, the daughter of the former governor of Vermont. And I just want you to remember her, because you're going to see her later. And she's going to be doing something rather lovely. So there she is sitting down quietly as a well-behaved child should. Let's keep going. Look at the decoration of the pavilion, viewed from the back. You see a little bit of the archways right here. You see how it's a little bit different, but you see how it's also very similar, isn't it? Look at all, hold on, Sam. See all the bunting, the stars and stripes, and the people gathered. It's a really neat picture. And look at the wood, it hasn't been painted, it's just been built. Go ahead, Sam. Here is Monseigneur Roy. So there were Catholic dignitaries for the entire country were here. This is Monseigneur Roy of Quebec celebrating a pontifical mass, a high mass on the steps of the new pavilion. This gives you a sense of the excitement surrounding the celebrations in 1909. Can you all see in the bottom left-hand corner there's a pile of lumber? So you get a sense it had just been built and they still haven't taken away the lumber. Yeah. Little children milling about, a really exciting day. Let's keep going. Here's Wendell Stafford speaking during literary exercises. Back in 1909, there was no TV, no internet, no cell phones. So people had really long attention spans and they could listen for hours. I promise you I won't talk for hours. I'm almost done. But a lot of people tell me when I talk, I wish you'd never stop. So I won't stop too soon. So in the front, you see the distinguished guests wearing their Champlain medallions, and Wendell Stafford is giving a very long speech that you can read in the Champlain report. He says, "It seems that this is the place where we should sum up all the lessons that have been learned by the celebration." Let's keep going. This is Henry Hill. Henry Hill was a resident. He was from a family from Isle La Motte. He had Isle La Motte connections, although he now lived in New York. And he said, "Welcome to Isle La Motte," and he also gave a talk to the distinguished guests. It looks like there was a wooden floor back in 1909. Let's keep going. Here's Franco-American delegates posing in front of a float. Like there were parades throughout the Champlain Valley, and I just wanted to show you how the French Americans had floats to honor their historical traditions. And here's the same delegates posing in front of a float of Champlain's habitation. Let's keep going. But I show it to you because I want you to see this float. This was on the Plattsburgh Airport old base. But the Franco-American delegates, to honor their history, had floats showing important elements of their past. And what you see here is them posing on a float of Fort St. Anne, reconstructed with log construction. So sort of off to the side in the middle, you see a little tower made of logs. And then you see like a palisaded fence, and that's all on the float. So they're just posing in front of it. And there's a little picture of Champlain in the middle that you can barely see. So yes, and the author of a book about the tercentenary, people were commemorating the history of the entire region, but they could also use collective memory to blend with their own personal identity and their dreams of the future. So Arthur Favreau, the president of the Société Saint-Jean-Baptiste of the United States, he photographed his infant child, his son, and at the bottom he put, "My Champlain," right? His Samuel de Champlain was a little kid. Yeah, so I have my Champlain's right here. Here's Samuel, he's blushing. He's really embarrassed. Yeah. So there's another Sam. Okay, it's a good name. Let's keep going. One of the most extraordinary aspects of the 1909 pageant is that they had a floating Indian island. They constructed an artificial island by putting barges together, and they decorated it and made it look like an island. So every day throughout Champlain Week, the island was floated to Crown Point, then to Fort Ticonderoga, then to Plattsburgh, and then it came to Burlington across the lake, and then it came to Isle La Motte. So the island would have been floating out there, the lost island of Isle La Motte, right? You think Isle La Motte is hard to find? There's another one over there. There was another one out on the lake. You can keep going. So here's an artist's conception of the floating island. I'm like Obama. I've got a fly that I need to swat, you know? Yeah, I'm being like tortured by a fly up here. This is, the artist's conception of the most stunning feature of the 1909 tercentenary. But let's have a look at what the real thing looked like. Have a look at this. They're floating the barges. They refer to it as Whitterby Island because Walter Whitterby was responsible for building it. So here you see some of the floats being towed across the lake to Isle La Motte by a steamboat in front. And you see some Iroquois longhouses and some bark-covered teepees and some rather cleverly done, I think. Let's keep going. They built a tercentenary commission with its funds. They built a viewing stand right on the side here for people to sit and watch the Indian pageant that would have been off across, like a little bit in the water. And here we see the celebrants waiting to see. What happened on the actual thing was a reenactment of the Champlain Battle of 1609. There was some war dancing, and there was also the native reenactors. They put on a play which was a play based on the story of Hiawatha, which you all know is a legend that was created by Longfellow. So 1909 was a time of the Hiawatha craze, and people were willing to look at it. So let's have a look at what Hiawatha would have looked like in 1909. So here's the Indian pageant. What they did was they had like planks that they would, with chains that they would let the planks go down, and there was like sawed-off logs for people to get up onto the island and come down into their canoes and go around. So here, look, you see the shore, and you see people watching, and you see the actual reenactment of the Battle of Champlain on the island. And let's look at a close-up. Let's look at the next slide. I managed, using technology, I made the slide bigger so we can actually see more closely what it would have looked like. And I can see some Champlain figures with plumed hats there somewhere, but it's hard to tell what's going on. Let's keep going. So that was an attempt to recreate this image, the original image of Champlain's 1609 battle that you all have seen this image many, many times over again. And let's just keep going. There's a few more slides. Here's a group of braves. So these are Indian reenactors. One of the things about the historical record is we don't really know exactly who these Native Americans were, but the man on the extreme right with the peace pipe in his hand and the Plains Iroquois headdress was the man that was reenacting Hiawatha. It's a very beautiful picture with the little children sitting in the front on the island. Let's look at the next slide. Here's a group portrait of the Franco-American delegates with the so-called Armstrong Indians on the floating island at the Champlain Tercentenary. And one of the aspects of the Tercentenary was a great debate because they had raised a lot of money to build a statue to Champlain. They wanted to build a monument. The Tercentenary celebrations happened in 1909. It took them until 1912 to actually decide where to build the monuments. because Vermonters wanted it on the Vermont side, New Yorkers wanted it on the New York side, and even within New York, the various counties were struggling to, each county wanted it to be in their location, so no one could really decide where to build it. So initially, there was a Franco-American commissioner called Louis Lafontaine who proposed that a big monument to Champlain be built on Isle La Motte. And here's a postcard from the time showing, it says here, site of proposed monument to Champlain. So the lighthouse here on the island was going to be extended. So let's have a look at the plan that they had for a huge lighthouse. This is the next slide. This is an architect's image of a giant lighthouse that was apparently supposed to be so tall and so strong that you could see it in Saint-Jean, Quebec. And the design was commissioned by the same company that ended up building the Champlain Monument in Plattsburgh and in Crown Point. It was McClellan Bloedel Bernstein from New York City. So here's the giant imaginary statue that would have been built at Isle La Motte. Let's look at the next slide. Eventually, for various reasons, let me tell you what happened. Vermont wanted it in Vermont, New York wanted it in New York. So eventually they decided that Crown Point, New York, had no real historical connection to Champlain or anyone, but if they built a monument there, it would be in New York State, but visible from Vermont. So everybody would be happy. Because Crown Point is where the lake is so narrow that you know, Vermont and New York practically touch. When President Taft came for the tercentenary, he scolded the governors of Vermont and New York and said, why can't you guys get along? He said he was going to erect a colossus of roads on either side of the lake. You know, he made jokes about it, like, why can't you get your act together? So in 1909, here on Isle La Motte, there was a monument unveiled, and here we see it. It was a boulder, a memorial boulder in honor of the war veterans of Isle La Motte. And this would have been erected during Champlain Week 1909, 100 years ago. So the monument was sponsored by the patronesses of the past, the Vermont colonial dames, you see some there to the left, and the daughters of the American Revolution. So we see how the tercentenary also meant a lot to Americans, not just French Americans. And there she is, the monument was unveiled by the lovely Miss Dorothea Smith, daughter of ex-Governor Smith of Vermont. To the right of the monument stands the young Master Henry Hill, that's a typo, Harry Hill, son of Arthur Hill. So there we see it, there's the monument to that was erected here in 1909. And let's see if there's one final picture, or maybe that's the conclusion. Eventually, Isle La Motte did get a statue to Champlain. But those of you who have walked up to it know that this is the cool, funky 1960s Champlain. What happened was Expo 67 in Montreal. Every state in America had a pavilion at Expo, and Vermont had a pavilion. So Vermont had a statue of Champlain in the Vermont pavilion at Expo 67 in Montreal. When the Expo 67 was over, they dismantled the pavilion, and the state of Vermont donated the statue that we see here to Isle La Motte and to the shrine. And that's how we ultimately, it took a little bit of time, but we did get a statue right here on the site. And I've kept you long enough, that's all I have for you today. So I'd like to thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Boudreau. I saw Bruce Hyde around, walking around the area. Is he in the pavilion? No, he was here. He is the Commissioner of Tourism for the state. And oh, there he is. Hello. Hi, Bruce. Just wanted to say welcome. We are going to go across the road to the statue that you just saw in the picture for a very, very brief, very brief rededication ceremony, and then up here under the tent for the barbecue. So please join us across the way for a very brief ceremony, and then we'll come back.
We appreciate your support. Island's been a very, very special place. And our intention here is to rededicate this beautiful statue that we've just heard about. So let's begin by asking for God's blessing upon us, upon this place, upon those who helped build it. Our help comes from God, who made heaven and earth. Blessed be the name of the Lord, both now and forever. And let us pray. Blessed are you, Lord our God, creator of the entire universe. You've made the sun and moon and stars, the earth and all who live in it. All glory and praise are yours, O Lord our God. Help us today to enjoy the beauty of this place, inhabited by native peoples for thousands of years, and happened upon by Samuel de Champlain some 400 years ago. May this place continue to be blessed by the beauty of your creation. May all pilgrimage here rest in safety and peace. All praise and glory are yours, God our Father, forever and ever.
Amen.
Amen.
This is a reading from Samuel de Champlain's diary. Hi. I set out accordingly from the fall of the Iroquois River on the 2nd of July. All the natives set to carrying their canoes, arms, and baggage overland, some half a league, in order to pass by the violence and strength of the fall, which was speedily accomplished. They then put them all in the water again, 2 men in each with the baggage, and they caused one of the men in each canoe to go by land some 3 leagues, the extent of the fall, which is not, however, so violent here as at the mouth, except in some places, where rocks obstruct the river, which is not broader than 300 or 400 paces. After we had passed the fall, which was attended with difficulty, all the natives who had gone by land over a good path and level country, although there are a great many trees, re-embarked in their canoes. My men went also by land, but I went in a canoe. The natives made a review of all their followers, finding that there were 24 canoes with 60 men. After the review was completed, we continued our course to an island 3 leagues long, filled with the finest pines I had ever seen. Here they went hunting and captured some wild animals. Proceeding about 3 leagues farther on, we made a halt in order to rest the coming night. We set out the next day, continuing our course in the river as far as the entrance to the lake. There are many pretty islands here, low and containing very fine woods and meadows, with abundance of fowl and such animals as the chase of stags, fallow deer, fawns, roebucks, bears, and others, which go from the mainland to these islands. We captured a large number of these animals. There are also many beavers, not only in this river, but also in the numerous other little ones that flow into it. These regions, although they are pleasant, are not inhabited by natives on account of their wars, but they withdraw as far as possible from rivers into the interior in order not to be suddenly surprised. The next day we entered the lake, which is of great extent, say 80 or 100 leagues long, where I saw 4 fine islands, 10, 12, and 15 leagues long.
A reading from the book of the prophet Isaiah. The favors of the Lord I will record, the glorious deeds of the Lord. Because of all he has done for us, for he is good to the house of Israel. He has favored us according to his mercy and his great kindness. He said, "They are indeed my people, children who are not disloyal." So he became their Savior in their every affliction. It was not a messenger or an angel, but he himself who saved them. Because of his love and pity, he redeemed them himself, lifting them and carrying them all the days of old. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. one more prayer and a blessing of the statue. Father, all powerful and ever gracious God, we do well always, everywhere, and especially today to sing your praise. Give you thanks in all we do through Jesus Christ our Lord. Jesus offers all people a message of peace and taught us how to live as sisters and brothers. His message took form in the vision of our forebear, Samuel de Champlain, as he envisioned a community where all might live as one. This message lives on in our day as a task to accomplish and a promise for tomorrow. We thank you, gracious God, for your blessings in the past, and for all that with your help we have yet to achieve. And so with hearts full of hope, we rededicate this statue of Samuel de Champlain. We rededicate our lives to secure peace and harmony among all peoples and build a society created in love and formed in justice. We ask all of this through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God forever and ever. Amen. You want me to invite people over?
Yes, no, you can.
Well, we just beat the rain. I do love the statue. I stay in the house there and I come over at night and walk around and look there, so it's been beautiful. So we have a nice barbecue up there on a tent, keep it dry. We invite everybody to come back and enjoy us. And thanks again for coming. It's really great to have you here.
Although all the pre-publicity mentioned that Governor Jim Douglas would be here, nobody explained his absence. The statue has been rededicated, and obviously it was a good idea to have that presentation by Professor Sylvie Baudreau underneath the pavilion in front of the chapel here. It would have been tough to do it out here with the rain threatening and with the wind blowing. It would have been tough to have her presentation outside. We're going to go briefly to the Mass that was held earlier today with the Bishop from the Diocese of Burlington, and there was a little bit of video problem at the beginning of that, so we'll probably be showing a little bit of that video problem and then picking up the Mass as it progresses with, I believe, the video cleared up about the time that Celine Paquette was winding up her reading.